I know. Did you get your boots at the station?
Oh, no.
No way.
No, right. Yeah, he was insistent. He didn't understand.
Yeah.
But they were fast going over the never go under.
On the road.
And even the backup plan went under. It was a raging fire.
Oh, not good.
Yeah. Maybe 24, maybe 48. Yeah, and then it just kept raining. Yeah, so he had some problems, but I don't think he's ever been trapped up here before. But you could just tell like the sun. Yeah, and after people get out of lockdown and the borders open, this happens.
Okay, so good morning. So you can hear me okay? I think so.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right, beauty. Thank you. All right. All right, so then good morning. Welcome to Soggy Chenrezig Institute on the Sunshine Coast. And so then we can spend a few minutes just to focus the mind, good motivation for engaging in this session before we go into the main body of the session. So then perhaps first we can spend a little bit of time just to focus the mind using the breath to bring yourself into the present moment. And if you already have a method that you use, then to use that. And if not, then just to use this method whereby you maintain an awareness of the sensation of the air coming in through nostrils and passing out. And as best as possible to remain focused on the sensation of the air coming in and going out. And as the different distractions arise, the mental distractions, the thoughts, then just to note these. And if there are other distractions like sounds inside the room, outside the room, wherever you may be, just to note these and to try to maintain an awareness that while we're doing this practice, the importance of trying to keep the mind in the present moment, to let go plans for the future, memories from the past, and any other distractions, sounds, and so on. Just to note these, not to try to crush them, nor be swept away by them, but to note their arisal and to try to maintain that approach whereby our business during this time of the meditation is to keep the mind focused on the breath. So then like this for first part of the session. So then, by way of motivation for this session, there is a story from the life of the Buddha when he was young, the Prince Siddhartha in the palace, that one day his cousin, Devadatta, who it seems was insanely jealous of the Buddha, or Prince Siddhartha even at that time, then Devadatta one day shot a swan with an arrow, severely wounding but not killing the swan. And the swan fell and landed in the lap of the young prince. And Devadatta demanded that the prince return the swan to him, saying, "It's my swan." And the prince said, "No, it's mine." And so they went to see the ministers in the government for them to make a decision, a ruling. Whose swan is it? And they decided that it was the prince's swan. But what does that mean? The ownership of this swan, this sentient being, this being. What does it mean? So what does it mean to Devadatta? It's an object to be hurt or used, or perhaps when he took it home, what was he going to do? Most likely kill it and maybe even eat it. But from the prince's point of view, even at that time, the swan being his meant it is a sentient being, just like all other sentient beings. And they are mine, but they're not mine from the point of view of being my possession, but rather from the point of view of being my responsibility to look after and care. Without exception, every single one, in a sense, is mine to look after, to protect, to respect. And so then the prince looked after the swan and till it was well enough, healed, and then, of course, released it. And so, in a sense, the story is about our lives. How do we relate to other beings? Do we see them just as objects, there for our use? And according to how we perceive it, either to harm them or to utilize them for our own benefit? Or do we take the pathway, that's one pathway, or the other pathway, that, sentient beings like fall into our lap, like they fell into the lap of the prince. So each time, in a sense, that each person, each being is a karma. We connect with another being, they fall into our lap, and it's for us then, if we follow that pathway of the prince and the Buddha, is to care for, to nurture them, regardless of who they may be. And so in the case of one Christian woman practitioner who was executed as a consequence of her activity of benefiting others, protecting others. As a consequence of that, she was actually arrested, tried, and then executed by firing squad. But one of the things she said well before that, in her activity, drove her to live her life, how she conducted her life as a model Christian, as a model Buddhist in a sense, was that all beings, most beings, she said, are helpless, hurting, and unhappy. So this very Buddhist statement, because helpless, from Buddhist point of view, means that most beings are helpless. They're born into samsara, uncontrollably due to the power of karma and affliction, and then helpless in relation to the ripening of karma, helpless in relation to the experience of their own afflictions. So helpless, subjected to this samsara. And then hurting as a result of their life experience, the hurt of being separated from the things that they like, of being confronted with the things that they don't like, and then not getting what they want. The first teaching of the Buddha was along these lines. So beings are hurting at the hands of others, hurting at the mistreatment of others, hurting as a result of their own karma. And then unhappy. Unhappy, to a large extent, not having a method to be able to transform their life in a really profoundly meaningful way. So then, we have made connection with the perfect teachings of the Buddha, in particular the Mahayana, and then as is been Geshe has been teaching, the light rays of the sun. Mind training like light rays of the sun may be very appropriate after the last week to get some sun. So then we are blessed by the good fortune to have access to this method, these techniques that have been existing and passed down through the centuries. And they're not just like they've been realized in the minds of beings. There are beings on this earth now who are the embodiment of this teaching, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa, and certainly our Geshe here applies to these methods to his life as well. So we have the good fortune to be able to utilize the methods of the Buddhism, so that whatever occurs, whatever manifests in the world, we're best placed to be able to deal with that kind of difficulty. All right, so then, as I said, Geshe has been teaching on this text, mind training like the rays of the sun, commentary on the 7-point mind training. Yeah, I don't think I've been here the last couple of weeks anyway. But of course, we see terrible things occurring in the world, and it's important for us when these terrible things occur that we try to apply our understanding of the Dharma in such a way that we're able to maintain the best state of mind in relation to this difficulties and tragedies that we see occurring in the world. Because really, if we're not able to do that, that brings into question either the value of the Buddhist teachings or brings into question our ability to implement the Buddhist teachings in such a way to bring change to our own mind. So of course, what's been most prominent in the news in the last week or so is what's been happening in Ukraine. Now, I haven't read the news, I think, really for the last day, so I don't know what the latest is on it. But it seems to me it's worthwhile to really reflect from Buddhist point of view, how we understand how people's actions come from their mind, and that all beings wish to have happiness, to be free from suffering, and that no person, no being, no matter who they are, is all evil. No being is so evil or whatever that we reject them. If we reject them, the problem is with us. We can't become bodhisattvas if we reject one person. So the more that we understand when negative actions come about, when we can see that they're negative actions, the more that we have an understanding which leads us not to have resentment or hatred or despair or whatever, then via the Buddhist teachings, we can sense that the Buddhist teachings are working. So in relation to that conflict, the information we receive, it seems, through the news, is there is a picture that appears of Vladimir Putin as the driving force behind this conflict. And indeed, that may very well be the case, because this is nothing new in history. From a historical point of view, there have always been people coming forward who have got this incredible power, dictatorial power, are driven very strongly to achieve certain objectives. In a way, Vladimir Putin is no different. So in relation to him, it seems to me, from Buddhist point of view, that firstly, it's important to recognize, if you really look at his life and where it's coming from and what writers are saying, his actions are coming from a deeply held sense of resentment and bitterness and feeling victim, he and the people he associates with his nation, and also a sense of entitlement, like that, along those lines. So it's important, firstly, it seems to me, that this type of mind that arises is a common problem for sentient beings, feeling resentment about injustice that occurs to them. It's very common these days, and also the whole culture of victimhood very much is alive in the West. So we may not be in a position that he is, with the power that he has and the energy and whatever else it is, the karma, to bring the forces together and to have the experiences he has, to bring it all together, to bring about enormous harm. But still, if we have this, we're residing within us a certain degree of resentment about things that have happened to us, like this, a sort of a bubbling, simmering resentment. That may not manifest in too bad ways in this life, but we have future lives. And if we have this within us, if we have a sense, if we have that type of personality, and even within Buddhism, there are certainly students who have a simmering resentment, find it very difficult to apply the teachings to change that. That death comes and we take rebirth. And we may have the karma to connect with many people and to have power. And the tendencies, predispositions we have are not much different to Vladimir Putin's, if we're that way. And when the conditions come together, it may manifest we have the power and the capacity to bring about enormous harm to the world. So it's important for us, from a point of view, an inner being, that all beings, it's not like he is an exception outside the Buddhist teachings. His mind is not what is talked about in Buddhist teachings and can be transformed. It's our mind, who is a decent Buddhist person. That doesn't apply to him. Buddha's saying it's no different. Every being, all beings of samsara, no matter how strongly their afflictions are, they're afflictions. We all have afflictions. They may manifest in different shades and intensities, but it's no different. It's basically there. And so his story, that what's happening there, we need to apply that to our life and to ensure, on the basis of what's occurred there, that we also don't become future Vladimir Putins, or that Vladimir Putin doesn't overtake us, takes possession of our mind. We have our own tyrant within our own mind that's full of resentment. So it's important for this. And we can see the examples of people. And when you look at what he's talking about, if you look at things from his side point of view, certainly you really look into that, you can understand his perspective. So maybe I'll mention that a bit later on. Firstly, to focus on the idea of ensuring that we ourselves don't become embittered by events. It's important to do that. And we have the examples of people, extraordinary examples of people who, even though they experienced a lot of injustice at the hands of others, they made conscious decisions that they would not live with bitterness. They would not manifest out their rights, my rights, our rights, at the expense of others, our entitlements at the expense of others. And so you have examples here, of course, of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who, when the Chinese came when he was only 15 years of age, so they were there and occupied the country up until the time he left, of course, when he was 25. So he's there directly experiencing the oppression of the Chinese during that period of time of his teenage years and his young adulthood. So he would have heard and seen terrible things. He would have heard the Chinese telling him that they had liberated Tibet. He would have seen an incredible level of harm that had been caused to his country. But still, even though that occurred, he had the mind. He would not turn against the Chinese, even while he was there as a young man and obliged, I think probably even when he was 15, he was almost, I think by then, 15, 16, 17, obliged to become leader of the country under the Chinese. But he did not manifest this anger and resentment. And you see how he was in the end obliged to leave his country because there was a real possibility he would be killed, assassinated by the Chinese. And there's images of him getting to India from Tibet, riding upon a pony. And in a way, if you look at it, it's the embodiment of humility, or even you could say humiliation, to be driven out, to become a refugee. Previously, they say he's like a god king, but then he's driven out, he's a refugee. And most leaders who end up in that situation, really their life becomes sad and embittered and so on. But we know, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, no matter how much he's heard about the hurt to his people, no matter how much he's lost, he never abandons the attitude of understanding and care for others, never buys into the idea of resentment to those who've harmed him and his kind. And we have a similar example within the Tibetan teachers. Most of these lamas, they never dwell on their loss. Their focus is on helping others. But we also, not just in Buddhism, we have the example of Nelson Mandela, who was in prison, I think, for 27 years. So he lost 27 of his years like that. And again, humiliated, mistreated in prison. At first, very much embittered. And when he was asked later on what changed, and he said, I matured, I became more mature. And he came to understand the point of view of the oppressors, those who harmed him, those who had harmed his people, even the prosecutor, who had not just wanted him to go to prison, had wanted him to be executed. And so when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, one of the first things he did was to invite the prosecutor for dinner. And some people were puzzled by it and asked him why. He said, well, actually, he was only doing his job. He had the capacity, the generous capacity to see other people's point of view. And his driving force was, however flawed it may be in the long term, was to not have a South Africa of hatred and resentment and paying back and all that, but rather to have one to have of understanding. He had the capacity to be able to see that other people, just like him, want to have happiness to be free from suffering, no matter what they do. And then we have the example of Martin Luther King, who carried that responsibility, an ongoing responsibility. We can see in America the mistreatment of blacks, people who were early on slaves, but even when their slavery was abolished, still treated like garbage, like secondhand beings, like subhumans, humiliated in a multitude of ways like that. So if you recorded all the injustices that had been done and focused on that, solely on that, the outcome would be very difficult not to have a mind of resentment and bitterness. But in his case, he saw his message as a Christian minister, it seems, was to not harbor this resentment, to have some understanding, to see the other person's point of view, and to not desecrate your own humanity by your resentment. So we have golden guiding lights existing in this world for us. And then we have Mahatma Gandhi, who started a movement for independence of India based on the oppression of the English, and would have seen in many cases where Indians had always treated as second-class citizens, but also mistreated in other ways as well, brutally. But rather than manifesting the mind of anger, he established his movement of ahimsa, which means non-harmfulness or non-anger. So it was driven, his actions were driven by that motivation of non-harm, Buddhist approach like this. And as he said, I think it was him that said, to be the important thing is to be the change that we wish to see in the world. We need to be the change. We have to be the embodiment of change that we see in the world. If we don't do it, how can we expect the rest of the world to change? So important in response to perceived injustice, that our mind doesn't become embittered, because if it does, incredible levels of suffering can occur. So one of the things, of course, Buddhist view in relation to this, Vladimir Putin has his own views, of course, very strong views. But it strikes me an important part for us as Buddhists in terms of the entrenched views that we may have, even as Buddhists, about good and bad people, or people that we may see that we can be hostile towards, to do the wrong thing. That the more that we are able to dissolve our solid sense of who we are, me, dissolve the borders of ourselves and others, and not make ourselves distinct entities from others. The more we're able to do this, the less likely we will perceive others in a negative light. Less likely we will see them as subhuman or whatever, or evil. Because if we take on board the Buddhist understanding of past and future lives, for instance, and that is when we start to ask ourselves how we exist and how mind exists, then we start to see that we have a physical basis which has come from our parents. But a more important part of our being is our mind. And that hasn't come from our parents. That wasn't created by our parents. And it comes from its previous moment. We can see how through this life, and then it enters into the sperm and egg of the parents of the current life. But it predated this life. And Buddhist view is that it's been existing since beginningless time. And that we've had infinite rebirths. So in this life now, you may be born male, but next life, you could be born female. And so if you're born male, and you have a superior strength to women and various tendencies you may have, you may be performing acts of harm. As we see so often is the case of domestic violence, and it's males more often than not that do it to the females. So the real possibility when we die as a male, there's a chance, 50-50 chance that we'll be born as a female. And if we're born female, then we'll be subject, we'll be exposed to the potential harm of males. So even though we're male this life, we've been equally male, female, like this. And so it's important from this point of view, if we say, how do we exist? We're equally male, female. It's a very narrow perspective to say, okay, it's true, relatively speaking, in this life, I'm male. But that's just a temporary thing on the basis of the karma to have this type of body. And the consciousness temporarily resides in this, on this basis. But next life, it could be another base, another base, another basis. And that's our nature. So forever changing our life like this. And so also equally, if you're born female, you have 50-50 chance of being born male. And if you're born male, there's a 20 times higher chance that you'll go to prison. Most prisoners are males, very few women's prisons, something like 20 times high men. And most men don't want to go to prison. But they go there due to the actions they perform under the influence of whatever it is of a male rebirth. It's a thing characteristic of male rebirth. So for female, equal chance. And you've been equally male, female over countless lives. No different, each of us, whether the male or female, equal numbers. Doesn't make much difference. Just a matter of time, equal male, female. So it's important that we see the other gender's point of view. And so then, of course, in relation to Vladimir Putin and the resentment that he holds, very strong identification as being Russian, and he was a KGB agent, you know, the what do you call it, Secret Service, I think a colonel, I'm not too sure. And as he himself said, the downfall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. That's his view of it. So of course he's going to have that level, that type of resentment, because he sees things just from that perspective. Very difficult to get outside that type of perspective, narrow perspective. But important, you know, you can sort of, if you sort of understand how it can be, the conditions come together and you identify yourself with your nationality, with what's happened to you. so on. There's no space for understanding the changeable nature of it. No understanding of how it is with karma. From Buddhist point of view, this is a karmic thing. So important then, to do as best as possible, however we can, to try to understand this, so that we don't have these solid views and see ourselves as victim, and not be able to see other people's point of view. So, but also as well from a point of view of us as Buddhists not getting to the point where we have hostility towards him for the actions that he performs. It's important. Because if we abandon one person, we can't develop the mind of bodhicitta. And even as Buddhists, we take Buddhists as an understanding. When you become Buddhist, it's not to harm others. So if you're cultivating and buying into the view that will be promoted in the media and by politics more and more, in labeling him the embodiment of evil, the more we buy into this, the more we separate ourselves away from our refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, which is based on non-harmfulness. When you become Buddhist, you're establishing this idea of not harming others. If you buy into this view, we undermine our capacity to be able to practice as Buddhists. So it's worthwhile to try to understand a little bit. Try to imagine a little bit from his point of view. Because that's what he's saying. His message seems to come through, if you listen, is his resentment because no one's listening to what the Russians are saying. No one's taking them seriously. No one recognizes in the West just how much they see themselves as victims. Not how much they see that they're being mistreated by the West and by others. And I know for myself that and this goes back a long time, but even to the Second World War, so that when I was a kid, I was very much interested in the Second World War, and I made model warships and model aeroplanes, warplanes, and also made army like this, and read significance about the war, and also watched movies, American and British movies on the Second World War. So I formed a particular view like that. That's how it was. But it wasn't until I was on my way to India that I went in Laos, in Vientiane, I went to the Russian Cultural Center. There was a book there on the Second World War on a coffee table in English. And I read the beginning of it. And I only read one page, but what I read there changed my understanding completely about the war and really gave me some perspective, much more of perspective of the Russians that is blocked off. And that was a couple of things. One was their point that from the time that the Nazis invaded Russia up to the end of the war, no less than 2/3 of the German forces, the Nazi forces, were fighting against the Russians. So that meant no more than 1/3 of the German forces were fighting against the combined capacity of the British, Americans, Canadians, French, whoever. It was clear from this, it was the Russians that won the war. It was the Russians that defeated the Nazis. In a sense, saved Europe. And they saved it how? By the loss of countless numbers of Russian lives, millions of lives. More Russians died than anyone else in the Second World War, sacrificed their lives. And at the Battle of Stalingrad, said in that book, more Russians died in one battle, the Battle of Stalingrad, than Americans' lives for the whole of the Second World War in both the European and Pacific campaigns. So the Russians hold this. Vladimir Putin holds this view, but since no one seems to be listening, so he develops this resentment like this. And then he sees the forces in Ukraine and the government are Western influenced again, and he sees this also as a threat. He refers to the leadership in Ukraine as being Nazis, even though the leader of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a Jew. He sees them as Nazis. And why? The reason why is because he doesn't see the Jews as being the great victims of the Second World War. He sees the Russian Christians, because many more of them died than Jews. So if you really try to see someone else's point of view, you make that effort, and that's our business in Buddhism. It's not the business of politicians. It's not the business of the media, to be honest, necessarily. But us as Buddhists, we have a responsibility to seek out the truth. And when you seek out the truth, then you start to understand people doing actions. Are they because they're essentially evil? Or is it because the conditions and the factors come together? And when that all comes together, conspires, it almost obliges them because it feeds their afflictions, their resentment. They themselves become a victim of their own afflictions, and it obliges them to do the things that they do. So for him, I think unbearable resentment going over the last few decades, looks like when you see it, irresistible desire to right wrong and to achieve their rights at the expense of others, because there's no sense of other people, the enemy, also being human beings and having rights. It's all focused in that state of mind on our rights and how we've been harmed. So the more that we can really understand that, rather than dehumanize him, he becomes an object of understanding and compassion. So that we also include him, but of course we also need to be aware of the harm that he's causing others. It's not a betrayal of the people, the victims, that he will create, but rather to create the circumstances in the future, if we have the kind of mentality that we don't allow for these situations to arise where resentment and embitterness arise. So in a sense, we have some responsibility where we can to look at the world events, but from the perspective of human beings wanting to have happiness, be free from suffering, all of it, and to understand how it is that people get to the point where they have resentment. Because the same thing played over Putin, and maybe it's the next Hitler. But Hitler only came into power. It only came into power on the basis that people were resentful. Again, people were resentful in Germany after the First World War because of the terms of the treaty of the First World War. Otherwise, if they weren't resentful, he would have just been a crazy person on a street corner. But when people aren't listened to, aren't respected, then it's a possibility. It creates the circumstance for that resentment to rise to such an extent that it's like an unstoppable wave that causes, could cause so much damage to so many people. Okay. I'm sorry, but there's okay. So I was going to say, do you have any questions? But there's this message here. It says, "Good morning, Venerable Tony. When we use the text, if you do not mind, could you please quickly mention the page number, please? Many thanks." So I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking to do the text because I didn't think I would really do justice to the text. It's best to, for Geshe-la to continue with it. But instead of doing the text, just to give my own rave, my own form of mind transformation in relation to the events that we've seen unfolding in Ukraine. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? Or anything they'd like to discuss? So what do you think about this idea that regardless of how negative a person's behavior might manifest, that we should be able to understand it from a point of view of them not being essentially bad, but has come about as a result of conditions? Do you think it's possible to do that? Or are there some people who are so bad that they're not worthy of our understanding? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I was just thinking, maybe could you shed light on how we can understand the separation between my mind and somebody else's mind? Like, it's hard to see where one begins and the other one ends. Like, I just can't wrap my head around it at all.
Hmm. What way you mean?
I just like, because we're interdependent, and I can see, like, there's my side, there's things that are coming from my side and things that are coming from that side. And I can also see that the separation is really blurry. And yeah, I just don't know how, like, there's talks that there's one universal mind, that we're all a universal mind, but I know I have to take care of things on my side, my business, and that basically it's all coming from my side. I don't know. I don't know. I think I'm just trying to get my head around it.
I don't know. I mean, for me, normally there's a sense of separation from others. That's my natural sense of grasping at me. Anyway, I have that view, and it's probably been solidified over this life. But it's only when that I've reflect on the Buddhist teaching, such things as like that rebirth thing and how you see people. It's very much dependent on your own mind, that I start to get some sense of that breaking down. So my thing is much more like me separate from my needs, and your needs are another thing. And I'm more important than everyone else. That's my natural, unfortunate state to go to. But that's such a cause of problems for me that I'd like to change it. But the universal mind thing, I've heard it said before in Buddhism that there isn't such a thing as a universal mind, right? But at the same time, the explanation that seems to be given, at least in the Tantra, of the state of Buddhahood in the example that's given is, it's like all these different streams that flow into one lake like that. And then from that lake, drops of water come out. And each of those drops of water contains water from all those streams. So in a sense, it's saying, from what I would understand, the state of enlightenment is that merging, and the lake is almost like the universal consciousness, if such a thing exists, I don't know. And that when Buddhas manifest out, it seems it is like that universal consciousness, because it's an all emerging thing, and they can manifest out in any form any being can. Whether they're still individual mind streams, I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't really understand that. But in the explanation, it sounds almost like there's a universal mind at the time of enlightenment. You know, like, what is there? Almost like ask the question: is there one Dharmakaya, omniscient mind, or is there as many Dharmakayas as there are sentient beings? The question, I don't know. This almost sounds like there's one Dharmakaya, but I'm not. It's beyond me at this point to actually understand that. Is that a question? I think it is possible to understand it, but do we allow it to continue? What do you mean by that? To understand what? The joining of consciousness, you mean? Did you hear that? There's no answer. There's a question there. I think it is possible to understand. Oh, here we are. Oh, I was talking about Putin. I was talking about Putin. Oh, okay. Do we allow it to continue? You mean like the fighting?
Can you hear me, Venerable Tony?
What?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just in relation to the meditation today, the lesson today, it's very easy to see things from Putin's perspective and understand why he is doing the things that he perceives to be right from his side. But the impact that that's having on other people, the impact that's having on the world, you know, do we allow that to continue? Or at some stage, do we say, this has to be stopped because it's impacting too many other people negatively?
Yeah, that's where I don't know, because I don't have the wisdom to understand, you know, what's the best decision. I guess in some ways it's a bit of a cop-out, but I don't really know, you know, what the right decision is. And that's what I think the political people are saying. They don't know. It's like, that is the issue. At what point do they stop? What do they do something? Because they say that about that. If Hitler had been stopped earlier, right? That's the example that's often used. If he had stopped earlier, then a lot of people wouldn't have lost their lives, right? But at the same time, you don't know, because if you do, you may exacerbate that problem. So I don't know. I would be, you know, I'm not a politician, but I guess if you're Buddhist, you try to think of it as best as you can from, you know, applying Buddhist principles. You know, from a point of view, even Tibet, you asked the question about Tibet. Tibet was invaded by the Chinese. There are people that have said, you know, that the Tibetans should have been far more active than they were. And the fact that they could have done something of the Chinese, because if they didn't, the Tibetans are fighting amongst each other, but if they'd stopped fighting against each other, back in those times, 1950, you know, they didn't have the technology that we have now. not the ease of getting into the country that, say, the Chinese could have now. And it would have been very difficult for the Chinese to get in through those high mountain passes. So they might have had more men, but they weren't familiar with their territory, and they wouldn't have had the capacity to live there, breathe and so on. So that's been an ongoing thing that says, well, there's been criticism even amongst the Tibetans themselves that they brought about their own defeat because they, but whether they could have actually stopped the whole of China, I don't know. But it's certainly a point of view that just because you're Buddhist, it doesn't mean to say that you don't take action. But what's the appropriate action? I don't know, in terms of his actions there. I would like to think that in Russia, there's a large proportion of people there who are decent people, who understand, that invasion is, potentially cause a lot of harm. And that would be probably where the strongest possibility of stopping it comes. I think they would have more power than the combined forces of NATO. But whether that happens or not is another thing. If it's a very strong principle of not harm and they stood up, that would make it very difficult for Vladimir Putin to succeed. And that's the power. That's the power of non-violence. So I don't know how it's going to play out, because we already know there are certainly people in Russia who are, quite ashamed of what's taken place. Yeah, so I don't know what, I don't have magical solutions to it. Well, just from a point of view of how we respond and how we live our life, to my way of thinking at least, it's important as a Buddhist person, and hopefully some degree practitioner, that I'm able to maintain a sane state of mind, a state of mind that doesn't get angry and resentful or confused or despair or whatever. Because when that happens, there's not too much, it's not too much you can do to help. But if you, as Mahatma Gandhi, if you can be the change you want to see in the world, then maybe you can do something. And in that space of mind anyway, if you have that space of mind, then you're better placed to be able to see, okay, what would be the best course of action? But even if you knew that, to what extent can you bring about that, those actions anyway? I don't know. Yeah, okay. Paul found the process that you described detailing how to see a situation or event in the eyes of another person was greatly revealing, practical, and one that I can see I could practice myself. I think it's an essential thing for us as practitioners that we need to be able to see the other person's point of view in order to prevent conflict, and in order to be able to live in harmony with other people. And it's a practical thing to do that. And, whoever we're with, if we're in a companion relationship with another person, to help that relationship work, to make it harmonious, that's an important thing to do in everyday interaction with another person. that we're living close with, to see their point of view, not just our point of view. And the more we're able to do that, then our relationships are going to be harmonious. And it certainly is the case living in communities. I hear Chenrez's Institute in one way as a community, but it's, I'm not living in a community because I got my own self-contained house. But I lived for 17 years in monasteries where you shared facilities, you took turns in cooking and so on. And then before that, I lived in shared houses. And it seemed to me it's an important thing to be able to try to do that as best as possible. It's challenging at times, but to see other people's point of view so that then you don't demonize them. They don't demonize them. And that is what one of the things that Vladimir Putin is doing at the moment. He's demonizing the leadership in Ukraine. He refers to them as Nazis and as being degenerate, and he calls upon the Ukrainian people to rise up against them. So it really shows there in his state of mind how it is an inability to see other people's point of view, to be able to see that those other people, the leadership and so on, the people there, they're actually human beings. They're not Nazis. They wish to have happiness, to be free from suffering. And no matter how much their behavior, their conduct, their views may be different to his, they're not demons. They wish to have happiness, to be free from suffering. And this is a basic teaching in Buddhism. It starts off with this. In a sense, its wholeness, its message is that the equality of oneself and others. Everyone is equal in wanting to have happiness, to be free from suffering. We're all equal in that way. And we're equal from a point of view of, as ordinary beings, having a mind that's conditioned by ignorance. And on the basis of ignorance, our attachment and anger manifest out. And we do actions from this point of view, actions which may hurt us. People do actions to us which may hurt us. And then also beings have karma, which lead them to manifest out certain kinds of behavior. So the more that we're able to implement these states of mind, then we're less likely to become Putin-like beings, you know, or Hitler-like beings. All right. Okay. So, any other questions or any comments? Otherwise, okay. We can just to dedicate whatever positive results from engaging in this session, the meditation, and then this idea, thinking about the events in the world, and especially what's happening in Ukraine, that on the basis of that we have a mind, we develop a sane, wise mind, so that we ourselves, as little influence as we may be, but that influence can be something positive in the world rather than the source of suffering for others. Okay, so thank you.